Hello, and this is the second video I'm doing on Terranigma. We're gonna look at some staff interviews where they talk. The people that worked on the game gave us some insight. There's also an interview where they explain the ending, which I found very interesting because a lot of people are wondering what happens at the end, and we did get some kind of an answer that kind of tells us what happened. Now, Terranigma is one of the greatest pieces of art that was ever made in any kind of medium. It it is one of video games' most tragic events because it never came out in the U.S. If this RPG would have came out in the U.S., it would have changed RPGs for in a big way forever. But unfortunately, it's limited to its impact where it only came out, which wasn't in the U.S. But it is one of the best. Uh, it's some of the best storytelling that you'll ever see. Anyhow, uh, the company that made the game is very mysterious. It's a company named Quintet. They were involved with a few games such as the Gaia trilogy, Soul Blazer, Illusion of Gaia, and Terranigma. There's the Genshin Saga, Robo Trek, also known as Slapstick. There's ActRaiser 2, and they were involved with games afterwards like Solo Crisis and some other games that are even more obscure. And they disappeared. And the guy that wrote the screenwrite for this game is this man right here, Tomoyashi Miyazaki. He started out really young working for Falcom, and he wrote the scenario for East 1, East 2, and East 3. So this man, took part in the creation of the RPG because the East series is way back from the mid '80s, and that's where RPGs kind of started in a way. And he left Falcom, formed Quintet, and I mean the guy was young. He was young. He's definitely one of the more interesting people that has ever lived, but he disappeared. It is not known what happened to him. People have tried to track him down. People have asked famous composer Yuzo Koshiro. He doesn't know where he is. There's rumors. They've asked former staff who have seen him, but not any time recently. And there's a lot of rumors about him possibly wanting to be hidden from the public, but nobody knows for sure. All I heard is that supposedly he's programming pachinko machines, but nobody knows really what happened to him, which is a shame because he was a great scenario writer. He has very good ideas. Quintet was also involved with Gust. He was involved with the first Art of the Lico. So if you look at the background, yeah, he was involved with a lot of things, but he is the main guy that came up with this idea for Terranigma. And so we're gonna go over to the developer interview. So Tomoyoshi Miyazaki, at least spelled his name wrong right here, Tomoyashi. Well, anyway, he's the director. Reiko Takahashi, scenario writer. Okay, I think they kind of mixed up the roles here, but he was the director. So anyways, so they asked me, Miyazaki, how did the Terranigma development get started? We started the planning for Terranigma very shortly after completing Illusion of Gaia, so we're about a year and a half into the development now. Of all our Super Famicom titles, I think Soul Blazer will be the most iconic Quintet game. However, the world of Soul Blazer didn't feel like a big epic. It felt more like you were playing a series of miniature set pieces. There was something I was left a bit unsatisfied with. Soul Blazer had a unique worldview, though. In that game, we tried to depict humans as viewed from a non-human perspective. So the inspiration for Terranigma came from the desire to combine that concept with an epic, larger world a la Illusion of Gaia. What was your basic theme or concept for Terranigma? In Terranigma, destruction and creation are linked together. To give an example of what I mean, your enemies in Terranigma are not simplistic bad guys, and depending on how you defeat them, the environment of the game will evolve accordingly. In this way, the combat is directly connected to the way the scenarios unfold. So destruction is a creative force? Yes. Also, another big theme for Terranigma is duality, or the idea that opposites are inextricably linked together as one. Destruction and creation will be a prime example of that. And then Takebayashi says, in writing the scenarios, I always had the duality foremost in my mind. I wanted players to ask themselves, for example, if it's really right to develop this town when it will destroy the natural habitat of these birds, etc. I see. It is not as though one choice is the right one. Takebayashi. This way, the player is always complicit, always conflict in the outcome, whatever they choose. If you don't want to destroy nature, then you have to face the consequences of an underdeveloped city and so forth. Miyazaki. Good and evil are two sides of the same coin. I hope players enjoy seeing the response to their actions after deciding for themselves what is right and wrong in a given situation. I was extremely impressed, by the way, with the graphics of the overworld map when you leave your starting village for the first time. Miyazaki. The first map you encounter is the underworld, dark side, so we used sprite scaling FX to make it look like you were on the underside of the earth. I think we're the first to do something like that. The story of Terranigma has quite a grand scope. Miyazaki. In the course of making our previous games, I started to think about what the actions of humans would like from a non-human viewpoint. There's a typo there. The heart of Terranigma's story lies in the perspective of the Earth and how it views human activity. The graphics for the scenes after you clear a tower and revive the continent look incredibly impressive. I understand those scenes used up 8 megabytes of memory on their own. Miyazaki. Right, but we felt it was justified because those are the scenes which are most deeply connected to the concept and themes. We use some incredible technology to bring them to life, technology that is actually used in creating TV weather broadcasts. Hashimoto. We use the same development software that was used by the English company Rare when they were making Donkey Kong Country. It's actually quite hard to make realistic animation with the Super Famicom hardware, and memory is another tough spot, but we really wanted to have a chance, even just once, to try out this development software, as well as fractals and other new technologies. Fractals? Futami. It's a similar technology that we use for polygon graphics. It makes it easier to display shapes that look natural. We've really worked hard on the graphics quality for Terranigma. How many times did we redo the graphics to get them just right? I've lost count. Hashimoto. I don't remember. Futami. And the final result would often turn out completely different from what we started with. Could you explain the essentials of the battle system in more detail? Miyazaki. For Terranigma, I feel it's more of an RPG action game than an action RPG game. I actually wrote that in the initial planning document. I mean, you control your character directly, so in that sense, it's a typical action RPG, but we also spent a lot of time trying to come up with gameplay elements that would reflect the joy of the turn-based RPG experience too. Enemies will make combo attacks on you. One will try to immobilize you so that the other can attack. For instance, turn-based RPGs use text to easily explain a fight situation like that, but it's a bit more difficult with action RPGs, I think. I really like what we managed to pull off with the messages being displayed in real time though. Ark's movements are really great too. It's not the smoothness of something like Aladdin, but rather the variety of different movement animations that are impressive. It's on a whole other level when compared to previous action RPGs. Does Quintet really have a thing for action RPGs then? Miyazaki. It sure seems that way since Illusion of Gaia, but the key thing for me is exploring the meaning of the word action in action RPG. Usually it implies fighting alone, but I think of action more broadly, as the freedom to control the character yourself, not merely in fights, but also just walking around and making other movements. Hashimoto. Take ActRaiser and Illusion of Gaia. They exist at opposite ends of the spectrum. In the ActRaiser games, it's entirely about platforming and fighting, whereas in Illusion of Gaia, that kind of action is just one aspect of the gameplay. For me, the quality of the action comes down simply to whether it's fun or not. The simple joy of feeling the character respond to your inputs. A big concept for us with Illusion of Gaia is how to share a taste of that joy with people who don't normally play action games. And Terranigma is also built around that idea. So yes, we do have a thing for action RPGs, but as a counterweight, we are also dedicated to creating something that has a wider appeal and is not just for hardcore action fans. Finally, please share with us what you think the Terranigma's sales point is. Miyazaki. There's a complete fusion between the graphics and gameplay system, such that it creates a strong sense of immediacy and being there for the player. It's a game that exceeds the capabilities of the Super Famicom, I would say. There's also the fun of exploring all these real-world locations and seeing how all the different dungeons, towns, and other visuals correspond with each geographical location. Takebayashi. We spend an absurd amount of time developing the story and scenario. There's so many local logic flags in the programming to handle all the different situations that even I had no idea how many times you had to play to see it all. Hashimoto, Actraiser, Soul Blazer, Illusion of Gaia, Slapstick. It's been a wild ride for us at Quintet, developing for the Super Famicom for these last 6 years. Terranigma is the culmination of all our efforts and expertise. We hope it stands as our defining work. In any event, we put all our all into it. We're pretty damn burnt out now. And so, at the last part of this, it says it looks like Terranigma development has been really Herculean effort for Quintet. Miyazaki, yeah, it incorporates all the various elements from our previous games. It's almost like a Quintet greatest hits compilation. Who wrote the scenario? Miyazaki. I came up with the general outline, but after that, the whole staff fleshed everything out and completed it. What have some of the challenges been for development of Terranigma? Miyazaki. This is a 32-bit ROM, so one thing we struggled with was getting a handle on something of this size and scope, and figuring out how best to use all that memory. Also, our theme for Terranigma was duality. The world of the game has an internal dark side and external light side, and the player's actions influence both worlds. Writing all that was also a big challenge. Hori, your games often have neat minigame elements in them, like gathering the red jewels and Illusion of Gaia. Does Terranigma have something similar? Miyazaki. Yes, it has a lot of things like that. Hori, how do you go about writing those kind of things for your games? Hori, for me, it all comes down to whether it's addicting or not. What is the number one thing you want people to see when they play Terranigma? Miyazaki, as the title Tenshi Sozo implies, I really want the players to enjoy the resurrection scenes because I want them to think about the meaning of the idea that we create our own world. We put a lot of effort into the graphics for the scenes where the continents are resurrected. I have no idea how many times we remade them. For a single town, are there multiple stages, phases of resurrection, or does it happen all at once? Miyazaki, for the big levels, there are 3 different stages of resurrection, but honestly it depends on how you play, and there's a lot of different ways things can develop. Hori, that must have been a real challenge to create. For the first Dragon Quest, the townspeople always say the same lines no matter when you visit them. But with Dragon Quest 2 and every game after, we made it so the dialogue changed slightly depending on what you did. Dragon Quest 5 had so much of that, it brought me tears. Miyazaki, I know what you mean. In Illusion of Gaia, at one point we stuffed it so full of dialogue that we were left with a mere 26 bytes of space. In the end, we somehow managed to fit it all in there though. Hori, also, I was wondering, when you're making your games, do you ever stop and think, is this really a good idea? Miyazaki, all the time. There's a mountain of doubts. Hori, developments always begin with a wealth of different ideas, but when it's time to actually get down to brass tacks, at some point one has to stop with the new ideas and begin the phase of polishing and refining what you've got. Even then, it's hard to stop coming up with new ideas because things often feel incomplete. When I actually play the games we've created, it's common for me to feel like only half of what I wanted to include is in there. Miyazaki, another concern for me is whether I've adequately explained the world of the game to the rest of the developmental staff. Hori, having a shared history with your development staff is very helpful for that, to an extent. We're currently making the 6th Dragon Quest game right now, and the same staff has worked together for so long that they know what we're all looking for, or going for. In contrast, you make a different game each time, so I imagine that must make things more difficult for you. On the other hand, while your games aren't officially labeled as sequels, they all share a lot in common and have a similar direction, I think. Miyazaki, it would make me happy if people perceived our games that way. It's interesting because everybody thinks that they're sequels. He seems to uh, embrace that or welcome that idea. Hori, the one thing I've been absolutely insistent on for the Dragon Quest games is that the protagonist must not speak. I want the protagonist to be the player's avatar, so I don't want to do anything that would violate the will of the player. Is there anything similar you've insisted on for Terranigma? Miyazaki, for Terranigma, the protagonist does speak, but for important scenes, we made sure that the player can select his responses. And so they continue to talk about just RPGs in general. I'm looking for just the info on Terranigma. They asked Miyazaki, where did you get your ideas from? He said, I love traveling and often use a world atlas to get ideas. I look at places on the map and get inspiration for different scenes and events. Again, Miyazaki is the guy that wrote Terranigma, so it's interesting to see what influences him. And then there's a third part to the interview. Oh, this is not Miyazaki though. This is the art, Terranigma. So that's the main thing. That's the main thing I wanted to cover. Because I'm not going to read the whole thing. Now it's been 16 minutes. So this is the part where they address the ending. But first, Miyazaki does say a bit about himself. He says, I wanted to write children's books when I grew up, partly due to my parents' influence, but I also loved games, and I wanted to do something that would make other children happy. I first started playing games in 4th or 5th grade, with things like Arcanoid, and tennis. Then when I was in middle school, it became possible to play games at home. So my family bought me a computer. I would manually type out the code from game magazines and play games that way. I was never very good at games though, so I spent my time improving the programming code and gradually come to understand how they were structured. I started going to this neighborhood computer shop, and I eventually got a part-time job there. That was my entry into the business. It might sound a little strange, but one of the things I drew inspiration from when making games was travel guides. Traveling and games are the same in that you set out somewhere with a purpose or goal. For instance, you journey to Nara to see the great Buddha, but just going there and seeing the Buddha isn't really what makes travel fun, is it? It's the unexpected things you find along the way that make it worthwhile. I think it's the same with games. Those special episodes that happen when you travel are published in people's travel accounts. I'm writing a scenario for a game. When I'm writing a scenario for a game, I often use them. In games, the pleasures of repetition are very common. Think of Dragon Quest, where it's fun to fight battles and get stronger. With Soul Blazer, you've got the progression of building the world as you seal the enemy's nests. For people who are bad at action games, fighting enemies itself might not be much fun, but defeating enemies here, it's closely connected with the building of the world. With the story of Soul Blazer, we didn't want to make a typical character story, but rather something that will be told from a different perspective. We wanted to make a simulation strategy game that is accessible without the usual trappings of hardcore simulations. Now here's where it gets very interesting. Here's where they talk about specifically the ending of the game. And we're almost done. This is all other things. They do interview the composer, but that's maybe for a different video, because the music is a whole nother subject. So here they talk in Terranigma. Why did you choose to have only one character to control Arc? Oh, that's not it. Right here. In the second half of the game, the player must make the ultimate choice between Overworld L and Underworld L. But whichever you choose, nothing different happens in the game. Was that intentional? Miyazaki, we thought about adding some consequences to that decision, but we came to the conclusion that we, the developers, didn't want to be the ones to express that. The L that is chosen will depend on the player. The story ends at L's home. But as for what happens after, perhaps Arc's future will change depending on which L was chosen. Are you saying that the conclusion of the final scene is left up to the player? Miyazaki, that's right. Terranigma is an RPG through and through. The player roleplays the character Ark in the world of Terranigma, but the reverse also occurs. That Ark roleplays the player. Therefore, as the creators of this game, we didn't want to impose a single conclusion on the story, or better to say, we couldn't even if we had wanted to. If the player chose the overworld L, perhaps Ark is reborn and returns to L side. If he chooses the underworld L, maybe he says farewell to overworld L and is reunited in underworld L after reincarnation. Maybe the player doesn't like either L and something different happens altogether. We left the conclusion up to the player's imagination. Everything has been your own fantasy. And so those are some words directly from the developers about Terranigma, how it started, the interpretation of the ending. And I wanted to share this because some of these interviews are not very easy to find. A lot of people don't even know that this exists, but it's good information. If you search Terranigma interview at SHM at shmublations.com, Terranigma interview, there's two of them, the two that I just read. But I hope you guys find that useful. I'll see you in the next video.